Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast. Tonight we bring you our season finale, number 50, Casablanca. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Before we get started, just a few follow-up housekeeping notes. First, we have an email list for each new episode. If you'd like to be a part of that, contact us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. There's some cool stuff I'm adding to it each week, like some trivia, behind-the-scenes facts that don't even make it to the show. This week I'm adding the top 90s movies according to our list so far. So, with that being said, we will be taking 2 weeks off to rest up after a rather grueling 50-episode season, and we will be back again in a few weeks to look over the list to this point, then do our much-anticipated favorite character actor performances list. So make sure to find us wherever you get your podcasts. With that, Happy New Year, Dad. Happy end to Season 1. How do you feel?
I feel great.
Simple and straight to the point. As we do each week, let's jump to the basic plot summary and recognition for this movie. Oh, you know what? I should back up just a second, and I tend to do this. I should probably write it into my outline one of these times. But what is your relationship to this movie?
I believe I watched this movie as probably around age 11, 12, or 13 on a late film with my dad. Trying to understand exactly what it was and what the situation was. It's probably one of the first times I'd ever seen Humphrey Bogart in a film, and I had only known Ingrid Bergman from other things when she was an older woman by that time. So, and then through the years, it's just a movie that I've gravitated towards every once in a while when I try to understand or appreciate what movies really can be.
This is a movie that consistently ranks near the top of everybody's greatest movie list. I don't think it's most people's number one, but it's usually inside the top 5, if not even the top 3. This is one that had a reputation for a long time that I knew of before I'd ever watched the movie, and I can say that I've probably seen it about a dozen times, but I can't remember the first time that I saw it. This is one I've watched repeatedly. I think I've watched it like 2 or 3 times just this year. So this is one I constantly go back to because it's just a favorite. We'll get into kind of the description of it. I thought it was kind of telling, the Roger Ebert quote that I happened to come across today, that most people regard Citizen Kane as the better movie. Not me, but most people do. And but Casablanca is the more beloved one. And I think to a certain extent that's very true. I think more people rewatch this one than they do Kane. They have a much easier time with this than they do Kane. And this is probably, when you think of the greatest movie of all time, which has been the point of the show since our inception, or since our start, this is one of those that I've been waiting to discuss because these are the ones that you figure will be comfortably inside the top 10, top 20 when it's all said and done. So I'm curious to see how this one kind of turns out and where we go with this. But as I mentioned before, let's get to the plot summary and recognition. So hang on with me, folks. Rick Blaine, played by Humphrey Bogart, who owns a nightclub in Casablanca, discovers his old flame Ilsa, played by Ingrid Bergman, is in town with her husband, Victor Laszlo, played by Paul Henreid. Henreid? I don't know how to pronounce that. Henreid? Oh, my bad.
Henreid.
Laszlo is a famed rebel, and with Germans on his tail, Ilsa knows Rick can help them get out of the country. That's not a really great summary. I wish we almost rewrote some of these, but anyway. For recognition, this movie was nominated for Best Actor for Humphrey Bogart, Best Supporting Actor for Claude Raines, Film Editing, Cinematography, and Score. It won for Best Picture, Director, Michael Curtiz, and Screenplay. It was the number 2 movie on the 1998 AFI list. Rick Blaine was the number 4 hero on the AFI 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains 2003 list. As Time Goes By was the number 2 AFI song in 2004. It led AFI's list of top 100 movie quotes with 6 of them in 2005. AFI ranked it as the number 3 film of all time in 2007 when they did their 10th anniversary list. It was a National Film Registry inductee in 1989 and it consistently ranks among many lists in the top 5 greatest films of all time. Basically, you can just search that on Google and find it, and it'll be inside somebody's top 10 somewhere, because it's everywhere. So, Dad, as we begin each week, what is this movie about?
Coming to terms with a chaotic world, understanding your place in it, patriotism, and how love at times must be put on the back burner for the greater good. I know that when they were doing the play, this is based on an unproduced play, and they were still in the process of writing the script as they were filming it. And so they actually didn't know how it was going to end, so they actually had 4 endings developed, and they shot the first one and then just said, this is the perfect ending, we're not going to do the other 3, and walked away. It had to end this way, which is ultimately Bogart and Bergman put their love aside for the greater good of humanity, and that's ultimately what the whole story is about. It's about survival and how you survive, but ultimately you survive by looking for the greater collective good. You try to find the humanity. Even somebody who's jaded and cynical like Rick throughout the film for various reasons, whether it be because whatever was the reason he couldn't go back to America, or because of his lost love of Bergman in Paris, even he is at some point referred to by Claude Raines as a rank sentimentalist. And ultimately, that's what it's about. Is this film resonates so well because it really epitomizes what was going on in the world in 1941, the feelings of patriotism, and the altruistic nature. People willing to volunteer for service for the military, knowing that they had a very good chance of not surviving.
There are 2 ways to think about this movie that I'd like to incorporate before I get to mine. Well, you know what? I'll say mine at least to start the premise of this. It's love, loss, and sacrifice. I think those are the 3 primary themes. I don't have a grandiose way of describing it beyond that. What I will say is there have been 2 particular commentaries that have sat with me in thinking about this movie. One, that the first time you watch it, and I think this was from someone's review, and I'm sorry, I can't remember whose, so I can't give them credit at the moment. But someone's review put forth that the reason that this movie has gained steam over time has more to do with the fact that the more times that you watch it, or on repeat viewings, you get past the initial love story aspect, and you start to think more deeply about the themes or the subtext of this entire movie. And so it takes on a much deeper feel to it the more times that you've seen it. The second is that, and I can't remember, I remember where I heard it, but I can't remember who they credited it to, but that this was cited as like one of the most American films, because it's this notion of altruism that we like to think we have about ourselves, but isn't actually there. And everybody in the end makes the sacrificial play for the greater good, but unfortunately, as we've seen over the last couple of years, that's not always the reality of what America truly is. Anyway, before we get into some political diatribe, as I'm sure you're ready to launch into, who was your best performer?
Bogart. I just thought Bogart was just, this role was the epitome. This was a role that he was born to play. I know that Bogart had so many different roles that he was so good in, but this film had the right edge that, you know, that you saw him fit within. It was a raw character, but also one where you could see that underneath Bogart's rough, gruff exterior, there was a heart. And I think that came across in a lot of films that he was in. And this film allowed him to show that. And so I just think he did a fantastic job in the film. And I know that there were a ton of other actors considered to play this part, including Ronald Reagan. I can't see another actor doing the part.
No, not at this point. It's so iconically his. I have mentioned it on multiple occasions in personal settings, not on the show. But I can't think of a better top 4 films for an actor than Treasure of the Sierra Madre, The African Queen, Casablanca, and The Maltese Falcon. I mean, the top 4 films of his is like a all-star Rushmore level knock it out of the park set of films. Like, we can go through it maybe, and you can throw out maybe Pacino or Nicholson, maybe Hanks, but even then I could start to pick those apart a little bit more, where these are 4 of the biggest classic movies ever. And I think they're all up on the greatest hits list for just about every, greatest movies collection that there is. That being said, I will shift slightly to this movie. This is probably, to me, his strongest role. The only one I could really compare it to, and I think he might be a slight bit better, or it was a more difficult acting job in Treasure of the Sierra Madre, but he so embodies a character in Rick Blaine and what you have come to know about Rick Blaine that it's hard to separate the character from the actor. And so, as a result, you might as well just almost rename it that instead of Rick, it's Humphrey Bogart. Because they're one and the same at a certain point. He has this great stiff upper lip nature to him that you can see a little bit in Maltese Falcon that came before this, where he's kind of withholding, he challenges people, he calls them on their bluff, spoiler alert, already into the podcast, but when Ilsa pulls the gun on him is very similar to several situations from the Maltese Falcon. And he kind of just dares people to do certain things because he seems to have what's the word I'm looking for? I lost it now, but nihilism. A certain nihilistic streak to his acting. And because of that, he just plays a guy who seemingly doesn't care, but probably cares way more than he ever lets on. Which tends to be a lot of these people who seem to act too cool for the situation. That they care a lot more than they let on.
It's an old saying of mine from when I was a kid. I came up with it, which is the person who says he really doesn't care is usually the one most interested.
But the way that he seemingly cares, and he's able to gravitate between being the distraught, despairing drunkard to being the man on fire with just his passion, and then there are so many different heights that he has to go between to the performance he has to give for this movie, and he does it with such grace and aplomb that you really don't ever take yourself out of what he's doing. He just seemingly finds the right note at any one time. And the performances by pretty much everybody in this movie, I mean, let's say this is probably one of the best casts ever, seemingly adds to the benefit of everybody. I've said I'd much rather have an all-star cast that gives, 75% performances than 2 leading stars that give 100% their best performance ever. Because I think it raises everybody's level. But he does so many things in this that I think he's the most noted for this movie. I couldn't go anywhere else but to give him my best performance.
We don't do this very often, but I just felt compelled to, so I'm going to, which is we don't usually give a rate who we don't think did the greatest job or who the performance let or some level of desire for. But quite frankly, after really trying to watch this more critically, Bergman really kind of got lost in this film. I think you could have substituted Joan Fontaine, Joan Crawford. There were probably
Betty Davis.
half dozen actresses that could have done this part and probably done it better. Other than the fact that Ingrid Bergman was beautiful and had the accent, which kind of added to the overall benefit of the script. I don't see that she added a whole lot to this film.
I have thought that way many times. If I'm going to say there's a stunted or a muted performance, I'll give it to Paul Henreid. I think we figured out his name was before. The Victor Laszlo character. He's the one by far that makes the least amount of sense to me because of how the character was played. But I will acquiesce on certain parts to Ingrid Bergman, but you have to really pay attention to some of the subtleties. The way that she gravitates between certain frailties, and I think, if anything, I'll pay attention to two particular scenes. The scene of her in the market where Rick comes, I guess, to talk to her after he's had his drunken episode. And she's wavering between, well, I no longer love you because you're not the man that I used to know. And she has to turn on this kind of icy vizier that you don't really believe, but there's so much subtlety to it. The other one is when she confronts him with the gun. So she tries to make him believe that she still cares about him, but then she goes to this other level of trying to do the severe because she's gravitating, and I think there's a way that she's playing somewhat of a teeter-tottering episode in that moment. If anything, that's her strongest scene, because, I left you once, but I can't leave you again, and she's constantly going back and forth. The indecision is palpable, but I will say that she is by far the least of the stars that you could give. But then who else would you give a best secondary performance to?
Me? I had a difficult time deciding, and I'm going to take the cheap, chintzy way of doing it. I'm going to give it as a tie. I'm going to give it to both Michael Curtiz and to Claude Raines, because Curtiz really brought this movie together and did the things necessary in order to make it all fit. There was such a big aspect of this film. It was being pieced together, and they were under construction restraints, and so they had to find scenes to shoot where they were using sets from other movies, and just in general, just piecing this film together. Claude Raines, originally the screenwriters, who were also the playwrights who did the original play, absolutely objected and threatened to walk off when Claude Raines was cast in this part, but afterwards they said he was the epitome of the part they had written. They couldn't have found a better actor to play this part. And so when I'm looking at that, it is. And quite frankly, it is really the part that Claude Raines is best known for. And I think that he really added an element to the movie that was necessary for this to have risen from up to the level it did. Without Claude Raines, I don't think this movie is anywhere close to the level it reached.
So I nominated Bergman for my best secondary a little bit out of default, but I also I've come to find different ways to enjoy the performance out of her in a lot of different ways the more I watch it, and I go back and forth. So part of this is more of a recency off of this last viewing, but the most charismatic award I gave to Raines because he's the guy who smiles and then sticks you with the knife and you don't even notice it through this entire movie. He kills Ugarte, Peter Lorre's character, and kind of just takes him away ruthlessly. He ponies up to the Nazis and simultaneously just does anything that he wishes. He is essentially trading someone's freedom for, let's say, sexual favors, which is not in so much explicitly hinted at through the course of the movie. And yet, all of that he does with this just wry smile that is inviting, that puts you at ease, that makes you unguarded, and somehow invites you in. And I don't know how he did it. There's just a certain charisma to the whole performance, because even up until that last moment, you're sitting on a knife's edge waiting to see, after the major is shot, which way he's going to turn. And at the end of it, when they're becoming friends, you're like, oh, well, isn't that nice? But the guy's a ruthless police chief who has no scruples. He even says as much.
Well, he's bound to be a diplomat.
I suppose. I mean, what else is there a politician during wartime than some type of military or police officer?
Yes. For all the comments you made, which is why I gave him as the best secondary performance. But for my most charismatic, I'm going to go a little offbeat here. I'm going with Conrad Veidt, who played Major Strasser.
Interesting. Okay.
He was charming and deadly and sinister all at the same time. And if you've ever read a book by Eric Larson called In the Garden of the Beasts, it portrays Nazi Germany in the early 1930s through the eyes of the then U.S. ambassador to Berlin. And that book portrays Göring and portrays Goebbels as being very charming, entertaining people. We have so much reason to, in hindsight, demonize the Nazis. And we can't understand, because of that, how Germany could have fallen into the trap that was the Nazis and was Hitlerism. When you start reading that and start understanding that these were men who were very common, very charming, had very good, had friends, had social arrangements, etc. But there was a certain aspect that was sinister about them, an underlying evilness that did not necessarily come out regularly and on a continuous basis. And I thought Conrad achieved that. He was a stage actor in Germany. He happened to be married to a Jewish woman, and he had to flee when he found out that there was an arrest warrant for his arrest and execution for not only being married to a Jew, but for espousing anti-Nazi propaganda in Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. So he fled and ended up in Hollywood and got cast in this part. And I think because of the circumstances, he understood what a Nazi leader or officer was really like and was able to really play the part in a very realistic manner and fashion.
I don't know. I have a hard time thinking that there's a more charismatic Nazi than Christoph Waltz.
But if you watch the performances of the two, I think if you went up to Christoph Waltz and said that his portrayal in Inglourious Bastards was
episode 4, folks,
and is on par with Conrad Veidt's, I think he would be honored, because I think to some extent he set the bar of that common, the charming, evil Nazi. They didn't just immediately come in and arrest and kill people. There was charm. There was a certain element about them that was off-putting and relaxing about them. But at the same time, you knew they were dangerous and what they were capable of. And I think that is really the standard by which the part should be played. And I can see parallels in the two characters in the two films and how they were done?
Yeah, I suppose I can a little bit. I don't want to call it a like for like, just because I think there's more eccentricity to Waltz's performance, but that might be one that comes up on our favorite character actor moments. Let's go to best scene. Do you have a first nominee?
Just because it's the opening scene, the whole opening scene, the turmoil of everybody trying to get to Casablanca, to try to get from Casablanca to Lisbon and then on to America to escape Nazism and the rise of fascism across Europe.
So before you continue, let me ask you to define what you mean by opening scene. Because there's the globe spinning narration to open. There's a couple of small scenes in the market kind of Casablanca, and then there's the beginning of the sequence at Rick's. And then it depends on how long you want to extend that sequence, because that first evening at Rick's, I want to say takes like 25 minutes between the whole Ugarte thing and getting to the introduction of Rick and then getting to Ilsa showing up at Rick's. You know, that whole sequence is a very long piece. So I just want you to define it a little bit clearer what you mean.
Before Rick's, that scene that goes from the globe until you get to Rick's.
Okay.
Because it's, you know, they're rounding up the usual suspects. You have this situation where it's the British couple and the guy's talking about how you have to be very careful, and then he realizes his wallet's stolen. That whole thing kind of sets the tone of the chaos, the desperation, and what you have to endure in order to flee your country during a time of war. And so to me, that just kind of exemplifies what was really going on in the world in 1940 and 41.
Yeah, the subtlety of that wallet stealing moment, basically, you know, you can't trust anybody, and then he's the guy that's stealing their wallet, is such a great subtle world building of the cutthroat nature, the desperation, the touristy aspect of things, and how much of a jungle it is. Metaphorically, obviously, Casablanca is in the middle of a desert, but how kind of that is built into the atmosphere of what Casablanca was at that point. So I agree to a certain extent that really drops you in a little bit more of a way and expands or contracts, depending on how you want to look at it, the universe of defining exactly the background or the place we're dropping into. And that does a good job of setting up my first nominee, and that's going to be the first full sequence. It's going to be basically that 20 to 25 minute sequence. Probably I could even shorten it to say before Ilsa gets there, but we drop in and it's Sam playing the piano and entertaining, and he's doing all of his I hate to say that this is kind of minstrel-esque, because that would go against the classicness score that I've kind of already put down in a modern sensibility. But you get that particular scene, you go, you know, nobody drinks with Rick, and people trying to impress him, trying to get into the VIP section where there's gambling, Rick kicking people out and being kind of the gatekeeper, creating this air of exclusivity and that he's an important figure as this nightclub owner. The one weird unanswered question that we never get, and that I was going to save for later, but how did he end up getting Rick's? Did he just move to Morocco and therefore he had a bunch of money, so he spent it in order to create a bar? Because that was his hobby, was being a drunkard? I don't know, but they never really explained that one aspect of leading into the movie. Either way, where you get that first iconic moment where they flash on Rick in his dinner jacket, his white dinner jacket, that's one of those like you see on all of the greatest movie of all time books, or that they constantly show on like Turner Classic Movies as like part of the clips, or anytime you watch the Academy Awards, that one is borrowed as like an iconic moment in cinema history when Rick Blaine first comes on screen. But you go through that, and then you get the whole conversation with Peter Lorre, and you set up the MacGuffin of the passports of transit, or I can't remember the exact name.
Letters of transit.
Letters
didn't
of transit.
really exist.
Okay. But either way. So, and you go through that whole sequence, it does a good job of establishing Rick's character because of the Ugarte situation, creating the MacGuffin, establishing Sam's character and how he fits into the narrative, who Rick is, without having to do a ton of explanation. And there's so much great dialogue in that scene for fleshing out the character. I think it's probably one of the best examples of great dialogue that I can think of that we've had. So what's your next nominee?
The Marseille. I think that really...
La Marseillaise?
Yes, excuse me. The scene where they the singing in the bar. From what I'm understanding, so many of the extras and the people in the film were refugees. The tears that you saw as they were going around the room while they were singing were real tears of patriotism from the French who were in the crowd, because there were so many French refugees that were in Hollywood doing the film. And it really becomes kind of the moment in the film where it not only does it show that the rise of the rebels over throwing off the yoke or the chains of Nazism, it alters or changes the direction Rick has in the film, the path he goes. Puts him in a position where he understands that his interests don't mount to a hill of beans in this world, and that he ultimately has to sacrifice his own personal interest for the greater good.
I would agree. It very much identifies exactly who Victor Laszlo is and his importance in what he is capable of, even through something as small as La Marseillaise. So you kind of laughed at me over the weekend when we watched this, because we were spending Christmas together, and that I don't know why, but like the last 3 or 4 times that I've watched this movie, I always cry at that moment. And I think it has to do more with my personal feelings on the current state of affairs in democracy, and what my inclination politically is toward what I feel to be true patriotism in the face of extraordinary evil. And I don't think that goes too far to saying that this movie, or this moment where it's people standing up for themselves in even such a small and subtle way to really show their unification behind a cause, is moving. I don't know why, it just is. So I'm going to go with the first time as time goes by. So that whole situation with Ilsa, she recognizes Sam. She doesn't really let on to Victor as to what's going on, but her introduction is, again, there's a lot of subtleties to everything that's going on that a song would emote. But how many times, and I think this is why people tend to have such precious memories surrounded by songs. There are songs that evoke certain memories for me. And likewise, I know there are songs that evoke certain memories for you. How many times hasn't somebody said, I can remember the first time I heard this, or something else, that somehow that creates a memory stored within us because we have a certain emotional connection to how things are. And this song representing this has been borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. That was our song. Okay, I didn't remember this being in another film in the same way beforehand, but it's such a small thing that ends up becoming a much larger borrowed trope because it's so true. It's a universal thing. When you're part of a couple or a romantic relationship, more often than not, there are a few songs that just seem to resonate with the honesty or how you see or view your relationship and how it connects to you. And the minute you hear something like that, it just floods all back to you like almost a PTSD sort of thing, especially if the relationship didn't turn out well. So I think there's so many different aspects to it, because I'll even take it from the part where she wants him to play it and he won't do it. Then she gets him to play it. Rick comes over, and that's how we get the connection that there's somehow a relationship between the two of them, but we don't get the full reveal until later that evening when Rick's just drinking himself into a stupor, and we get the whole flashback in order to like fill us in on exactly what happened and why this song is important, how Sam was introduced to the two of them, that sort of thing, and that fills all in, but through the course of what this piece of music meant to them in that moment. So what is your next one, if you have one yet?
Rick and the Bulgarian couple.
Yep, I had this one too.
Yep. The Bulgarian woman who talks to Rick about her husband, and he is such a boy. That was Joy Page, actress playing that part, who happened to be the stepdaughter of Jack Warner, head of the Warner Brothers studio at the time. Only Humphrey Bogart, her, and Dooley Wilson, who was Sam, those are the only three actors who had lines in the film that were American. Everybody else was foreign-born. But that scene, it shows, and again, I go back to the line where Claude Raines goes, getting involved in my romantic affairs. You're just a rank sentimentalist.
I think this takes on a much deeper feel because up until that point, Rick has been an isolationist, that he doesn't want to stick his neck out for anybody. I think in many ways it's reflective of how America was for both world wars, that they had withdrawn, they had been hurt before on the world stage, and so they didn't want to necessarily get involved in something that wasn't directly going to benefit or that they needed to be involved in as a whole. But in this one example, he takes pity and he realizes the plight of someone else and does the altruistic thing. And it's this small act where he doesn't have to do anything but recognizes exactly the sentimentality of the moment. And you can see it in all of the employees, what is it, Fritz or Franz or whatever, and then the Russian bartender both hug him afterwards to thank him for doing this kind act and saving her from something she would have probably had to live with for the rest of her life in a very painful manner. So it really starts to open up the rest of the movie as to what Rick is capable of, and that he has somehow opened himself up again, made himself vulnerable to the possibility of what relationships can be, that he's starting to heal, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And that leads to the scene I already mentioned before, Rick and Ilsa reuniting, and that old classic movie trope of the spinning light on the light tower that implies, yes, kids, they did implications instead of just raw nudity, sex. So, just in case that wasn't something that anyone picked up on. But anyway, the point being that whole interplay between the two where she confesses her feelings again toward him, that she still loves him, that he has to think for the both of them, and then he has to come up with the plan, where she basically puts it back on him as to the choices that he has to make, really kicks off the final third of the movie. And I think there's just so much power to the whole scene. One, from the Ingrid Bergman standpoint, I think it's her strongest scene. But two, all of the things that Rick has to take in and process at the same time. It would be overwhelming for most of us, but he seems to just be one of the coolest customers that you could ever find.
Well, it's just that some people have a tendency, because of their physical and genetic makeup, that when they're in situations of crisis or stress, they just handle it differently than everyone else around them. So they just seem like they're able to
talked ad
calmly do it.
nauseum about that, yes.
Well, okay. So I think to some extent Rick has had that, and that exemplifies through this scene, or through the scene you mentioned.
Do you have any other nominees?
Obviously, the ending scene.
All right, to get to that, I have a different one, because I think that's the final one that we should coalesce around. But the other one that stood out to me, and I don't know if this is noteworthy or not, the conversation between Rick and Victor at the bar on the night that Ilsa's there is somewhat strange to me. Rick is such a strong and powerful character in that moment, and yet Victor is somehow being the bigger, more altruistic of the two. Rick has essentially gotten the go-ahead from Ilsa that she can't leave him. And Laszlo is giving the go-ahead without knowing it for them to be together, because he seems to think that he's making the sacrificial play, and he kind of understands or knows what's going on, but it never really gives you a hint as to why. And he's seemingly okay with it. So maybe it's my misunderstanding, because I don't know if I could ever be that altruistic about somebody I loved that much, but maybe it's because I've never been in that situation.
Well, it does make some sense, because there's sometimes people that you love that you know as a nature or as a result of the love that sometimes you have to let go because it's better ultimately for them. How many times or how many songs have you ever heard where it talks about, and I know that there's a Genesis song from the late 80s, early 90s, that we can't live together, we can't live apart. We knew that situation from the very start. And that's a lot of times people's relationships. And you have to understand that even though you may love somebody, you need to not hold them back. They need to move forward, and you have to take that sacrifice.
I think that's a reality that exists in art way more than in reality.
Yeah, I would assume that to be the case. You would be one of those 2%ers who could actually achieve or do that.
Well, that can separate themselves enough from that. I mean, maybe one of the other subtexts or themes to this movie is the idyllic nature with which every character seems to make their decisions in the end. I mean, maybe that's the reason that this movie is beloved, because it's an ideal that we wish we could have for ourselves, but never truly are. And I think I kind of brushed on that before, saying that for an American film. But I think maybe that's just universal. It's not restricted to Americans.
I think it's a humanity issue. I think it's
That's what I mean, a universal issue.
I think in general, humanity wishes to be in that situation.
That we can make the sacrificial play. I can say firsthand that I've attempted many times and thought that I could make the altruistic decision. And then when the moment of truth comes, I just can't do the thing that I want to. Even I will start doing it and then pull back, because it's just so ridiculously hard to do. So to believe anybody could do that and accomplish it, ultimately in the scene that we'll now end with, so the airport, we're going to save most of that scene for best lines, but he does two very small things, and one which is not really discussed. He comforts her, which is the big monologue. He basically says, we had our time, you brought it back, I'm no longer sad about you leaving, I understand it and I've made peace with it. We will always have the memories of that, but we need to now move forward. But then he also gives the gift to Laszlo by saying there really wasn't anything between us, and ignoring the exact facts, basically giving him the lie to believe in, because he knows that Laszlo needs Ilsa by his side in order to accomplish what he needs to in the fight, I guess, propaganda-wise, against Nazism. And so there are so many different pieces. First off, it is one of the most classically redone scenes. I'm trying to think. Scenes where you would almost read word for word complete stretches of dialogue as a monologue. There's this. There's that scene from the back of the car in On the Waterfront. There's the final courtroom scene from A Few Good Men. But this is up there because there are so many just pure deliveries, and it's just so good because you believe and hang on every word of it that he's being sincere somehow.
Yes. I've always meant to try to track down if there's a screenplay of the other three scenes or three endings that they had. If they're out there floating around. You mean the
non-SNL versions?
Yes. Because I would love to read them and just see what other people thought would potentially be as good or better scene. Because I can't imagine what it would be, because this scene just played out perfectly. It ended perfectly. In fact, this was not supposed to be the ending scene. There was supposed to be one more scene that showed Rick and or Humphrey Bogart and Claude Raines actually on a ship heading toward Algiers to fight in the what was Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, as part of the Free French. And they couldn't get Claude Raines in because of his schedule. And finally, David O. Selznick said, "Why are we trying to do this? This ending is perfect. Let's just stop and end it right where it was."
Yeah, sometimes you wonder. Again, this goes to the point of all the happy accidents that have to happen sometimes in order for things to work exactly out the way they should. So my favorite scenes, I'll either go with the Marseillaise or Rick helping the Bulgarians. I just really like both of those scenes because I think those are the emotional moments or the pivot points of the movie around which you start to see the growth or redevelopment of Rick's character in multiple different ways. But La Marseillaise is, and I know I'm probably butchering it, so if you're French, I'm just sorry. I won't even try. But there's such a moving aspect to it to me that just resonates with me. But what was your favorite?
That scene, and specifically the very end where Strasser orders the bar to be closed.
Okay.
Because I quoted that line so many times over the last 30 years.
Yeah, because you're a snarky asshole.
Where Claude Raines goes, Bogart says, "Well, what reason do you have for shutting me down?" He goes, "I'm shocked to find that there's gambling going on in this establishment." And then, "Captain, here's your winnings."
I have that down for best lines, so thank you for...
Yes.
But anyway, go ahead.
It's just the epitome of hypocrisy. And I use that line so often for various things. I think I've even used that line or quoted that line in briefs I've written because
of the
hypocrisy.
At least 25 that I can remember offhand.
Yeah.
Yeah, because, again, you're a snarky asshole. But most indelible moment is the ending.
Yes.
You really can't go in too many other ways. I think of the 6 lines that were nominated by AFI for the top 100, I want to say like 3 of them come from that last scene or that last monologue. So it's not shocking, and it's just so good and engrossing. I could probably rewatch just the ending, and it worked just as well without the rest of the context because I've seen the rest of the movie. There are certain scenes you can just watch by themselves.
Yes.
So, this is a good time to take a quick break for one of our sponsors. We'll be right back. Welcome back. As we were just about to get into best lines before the break, we will do that now. So, Dad, what is your first nominee for best line?
Strasser, what is your nationality? Blaine, I'm a drunkard. Renault, that makes Rick a citizen of the world.
One of the more famous lines that doesn't get its due and was the indirect name for another famous movie, Captain Renault, round up the usual suspects. Captain Renault, round up the usual suspects.
Yes. Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine.
Yes, that is rather iconic, if you will. Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. The only other one that I had for best lines before we get to funniest lines and the big set here, but the most misquoted line of all time, play it, Sam. Play as time goes by. It is not play it again, Sam. That is never said during the course of this movie. So do you have any others before we get to that final monologue?
Well, the funniest line, I love the little scene with the two people where they're talking about how we're going to America and Mama and I will always speak English. And instead of time, it's like, you have watch? Because they mix watch up with time and it just plays. I couldn't find the exact dialogue anywhere, but I just thought that was such a cute little line that kind of epitomized people trying to learn English.
Yeah, there's so many good dialogue conversations between people. Sidney Greenstreet has a couple in this movie with Rick Blaine as well that a lot of people don't pick out, but are very good in their subtlety as well. And I think there's two people that really genuinely understand exactly who the other is and that they're rivals, but not necessarily adversaries. It's kind of an interesting way of going about it, but anyway.
Just an anecdote. I appreciate that because if you've traveled internationally, you just kind of assume people will always speak your language, and then you are rudely awakened to the fact that not everybody speaks another language. And I think back because we actually got a Christmas card from some friends of ours that we met on a cruise ship years ago while we were in the Mediterranean. They're from North Ireland. But there was another couple on the ship who were German, and they just looked so sour and dour and just were not having a good time. And they would speak to each other in German, and they just kind of sat off in the corner and kind of scowled. And your mother, who being fluent in German, I said, you should go over and just talk to them in German. And all of a sudden, the fact that there was somebody else on the ship who spoke German, their entire trip and their attitude changed tremendously because they would just come up to her because she could translate from German to English for them to talk to somebody else. And it didn't take much time, but you could just tell. And so whenever I see these little scenes in movies where people are struggling with languages, I just understand the frustration that people have not being able to communicate and being understood.
Feeling I have often feared many, many times. I know the rest of you are bold world travelers and don't mind sticking yourselves into some weird situations. There are very few things in this world that are more off-putting to me than the possibility of not being able to talk to somebody in depth or not be able to communicate myself effectively. Anyway, let's get into this final dialogue. So, Rick, because you're getting on that plane. Ilsa, I don't understand. What about you? I'm staying here with him, points to Renault, till the plane gets safely away. No, Richard, no. What has happened to you last night? Last night we said a great many things. You said I was to do the thinking for both of us. Well, I've done it since then, and it all adds up to one thing. You're getting on that plane with Victor where you belong. But Richard, no, Now, you've got to listen to me. Do you have any idea what you have to look forward to if you stayed here? 9 chances out of 10, we'd both wind up in a concentration camp. Isn't that true, Louis? I'm afraid Major Strasser would insist. You're saying this only to make me go. I'm saying it because it's true. Inside of us, we both know you belong with Victor. You're part of his work, the thing that keeps him going. If that plane leaves the ground and you're not with him, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life. But what about us? We'll always have Paris. We didn't have it before. We'd lost it until you came to Casablanca. We got it back last night. When I said I would never leave you, and you never will. But I've got a job to do too. Where I'm going, you can't follow. What I've got to do, you can't be a part of, Ilsa. I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of 3 little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Someday you'll understand that. Now. Here's looking at you, kid.
When they first started doing the shoot, Bergman and Bogart had lunch with a third person, whose name slips me right at the moment, but both of them thought that the dialogue was cheesy and that the script was poor, and that they were going to come out looking buffoonish when this was all done. And so when you look back at that and if you were to just read those lines as they were without it being within the context and delivered by the actors as they did, I could see where it would almost seem a little cheesy. But it worked.
Yeah. Here's looking at you, kid.
That was ad-libbed.
Okay.
Bogart created that line because the backstory is that Bergman, trying to learn how to speak English because she was very poor at English when she came to America in 1941, played poker with the stagehands because they would teach her English while she was playing poker. But she had played poker as a girl, as a teenager with her dad. So she played poker. Well, Bogart would watch, and whenever she'd win, he'd go, "Hey, here's looking at you, kid." And so that line just got in there, and whether he just put it in or Curtiz, who had heard it, said, "Just drop it in where you think it fits," is unclear. But that line was Bogart writing.
Interesting. Do you have any others that you want to nominate before we get to funniest line?
No.
All right, so my first funniest line. Heinrich Strasser, are you one of those people who cannot imagine the Germans in their beloved Paris? Rick Blaine, it's not particularly my beloved Paris. Can you imagine us in London? When you get there, ask me. Humph, diplomats. Reno, by the way. How about New York? Well, there are certain sections of New York, Major, that I wouldn't advise you to invade. Waiter, will you ask Rick if he will have a drink with us? Carl, the head waiter. Madam, he never drinks with customers. Never. I have never seen it. What makes saloon keepers so snobbish? Perhaps if you tell him I run the 2nd largest banking house in Amsterdam. 2nd largest? It wouldn't impress Rick. The leading banker in Amsterdam is the pastry chef in our kitchen. Well, we have something to look forward to. And his father's the bellboy.
So, by the way, Leonid Kinsky, the bartender, the Russian bartender, got the part because he was Bogart's drinking buddy.
Okay. I'm shocked that there is gambling in this establishment. Sir, here are your winnings.
Yes. Yes. It's just the epitome of hypocrisy.
Are you ready to jump into the scoring with our patented Stanley rubric?
I am.
What the hell was that?
I am.
Did you go Lecter on me?
I am.
All right. Legacy, what'd you have down?
10. This film has the most legacy I can think of. There are so many films that have scenes that are like lifted right from this that are meant to be, and it's I mean, when they were doing commercials, when they first started having the ability to digitalize films and images and drop them in and recreate commercials in the late 90s or mid to late 90s, Bogart made his image made all this money, and they're pulling images from Casablanca up and putting them in things, selling, I think it was Budweiser or whatever it was. And it's just iconic. I think, and this is always what I think, or I kind of understand, just type Casablanca into Google search. You get the movie. You don't get the city.
That is done by regional IP, so that's not exactly telling. I'm sure if you were in a different location that it might be a little different.
Okay, but still, I'm in the Midwest of the United States.
Well, yes, you have no plans to visit Casablanca, nor do you need a map of the city in order to get around.
Okay, whatever. But I give it a 10. It's a 10 on Legacy.
Unless you're doing your middle school report on the geography landscape of Morocco, I doubt that you'd be searching the country as opposed to the movie. But here's what I will give you. I would be very tempted to give this a straight 10. However, I'm going to give it a 9.5 on just a small caveat. There are not a lot of people that I can tell you that, people that see a lot of movies, but that have ever seen this. They might know of it, but I can guarantee there is a huge subset. Other than us, okay? We're the movie people. How many people do you think, or what's the percentage of people in our common friend group that have actually seen this movie, that are maybe under the age of 40?
Wow. I guess I never even thought of that, because I think
I think this lives more as a legacy than it is in something that people have actually seen or really know anything about. I think if you quoted half these lines, I'm not sure how many people would know it was from this movie. This is probably the third most well-known movie between about the beginning of film and about 1950 to people of a modern era. But it's between that. Well, maybe I'm going to place it actually number 4. Wizard of Oz is probably number 1. It's a Wonderful Life is probably number 2. Gone with the Wind is probably number 3, and this is probably number 4. So,
okay.
I think people have heard of this movie. I just don't think anybody's seen it. So I had to give it a 9.5 because I think it's almost a travesty in that essence. That's the one caveat I'll draw back on it, because we said this is on a lot of people's top lists. This is a beloved movie. I think if people have seen it, they understand it, especially those that have seen it once, usually have seen it multiple times. There's just a unfortunate air about the current population, basically millennials and through Gen Z, that are not willing to watch anything in black and white or watch anything that was made before about 1970. Which I
suppose I understand your point. I wish it wasn't the case, but I can understand it clearly, because the number of people, for instance, you play a tune. Well, for example, you play the William Tell Overture, and everybody goes, "Oh, the Lone Ranger." It's the people understand, but it's more of the pop culture aspect of it than actually appreciate it for what it was and what it accomplished. I wish it wasn't the case, and maybe you're right. I would love to probably do a poll of who's actually seen Casablanca, but
you have the ability to do it. You have a surveyable audience that you employ. I just know that I work with several people, and I can say out of the 8 people that are in my office, I can probably guarantee only 2 of them have seen this movie.
All right. Well, so actually the office is open for part of the day tomorrow. I may just post it on the group Skype chat and just ask
do it on everybody chat. Nobody is going to participate. I'm just going to tell you that because they don't want to be shamed. So you should probably ask them either on a personal level, like by talking to them which, again, I know the difficulties of that with socializing and distancing and all of that, or have them private message you their response. Impact significance, I went with an 8.5. This is influential in its storytelling and directing. It indirectly has given us a lot of great cultural quotes and lines, but I think it was rather muted at the time that it came out. I think it's gained steam or legacy after the fact more than it had in the moment. This did win Best Picture, but it was originally shut out of a lot of the critics' awards circles because of the release date timing. They wanted to sync this up with Operation Torch, if I remember right, or the success of Operation Torch. So it came out technically in a limited release in 1942, but then its wide release wasn't until 1943, so they weren't sure which awards categories to put all of this under, and so it just got kind of varied. But the fact that it lost out in the New York Critics Association Awards to a film I've never even heard of, this is not indicative of the impact I think that it has now in a modern sense, as opposed to that it did at the time. So I think this has struck a chord the longer it's gone on as opposed to in the moment. So I gave it an 8.5.
I went with an 8 for a lot of the same reasons. Art is hard to justify or to critique at the time it's done, which is part of the problem I have a lot of times with the Academy Awards and the difficulty that the Academy Awards have for actually picking the best film of the year. I think back of the fact that the critics just absolutely hated Impressionist art in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it wasn't until later that Monet, Manet, Cezanne, Gauguin gained in popularity and were appreciated for what they were. I think to some extent that's one of the reasons why we're not judging films within we have a 5-year moratorium on the films we're assessing so that we have a good perspective of the films.
Well, that's exactly my point of view, because I think you can't get a full, accurate sense until much later. I think you can't get enough perspective on a movie until you step back from it. And I think, in fact, not only does the Academy Awards not do a good job of that in how it's set up or it's in its premise by doing those contemporaneously, but rather it actually doubles down on that. With the fervor over award season and all of the spotlight being on these, then we pick these apart in ways that we probably shouldn't. And it ends up causing a lot of really good movies to go under this microscope that's undeserved. All right. This was my toughest category overall. I set a number that I'm not going to give right away because I'm really not married to it. I could not figure out what was a good number to give novelty. And here's why. The setting is different and unique. There were not a lot of movies set in a faraway foreign location that's exotic, like Casablanca. There certainly weren't movies up to this point that were trying to do this type of setting. The MacGuffin is a little bit different, the letters of transit, but the anti-hero that Rick Blaine wasn't new, even to Bogart, because he's basically playing a more polished and a more heartbroken version of Sam Spade. This wasn't, or a contemporary war film was not novel for this one. We had just won a award for Mrs. Miniver for Best Picture. So that wasn't even like novel in and of itself. Great Bogart performances. We had already had a couple. So I failed to see where the novelty was, and the reason why I'm not giving my score is I'd like to see, or hear your argument before I place a final number on it. I have an idea, but I just would like your opinion first.
Okay. Ultimately, the novelty rests in the fact of what it exemplifies, which is it shows the rawness of refugee life and what takes place with refugees, what they will do in order to survive, the extent that which they will go in order to find a better life. And I could not imagine or think of a single film where the plight of a refugee was exemplified in anything that had existed up to this point. Now, the setting, no, that's not novel, because Warner Brothers had a huge hit with Algiers in 1938. And so that's it wasn't novel. In fact, a lot of people referred to this as the new Algiers film because they just assumed it was the same thing. Warner Brothers just trying to capitalize on the success of another film that was done a few years before. So to that extent, there's a certain markdown. And I understand your point that Bogart played similar characters in The Maltese Falcon and whatever. But the novelty, to me, this film has the same novelty. It's reminiscent because, if you've ever listened to, and I listen to old-time radio periodically on Sirius XM because it gives me an understanding of another time during the radio era, the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And if you've listened to any of the reports from Edward R. Murrow, from the Blitz, the Battle of Britain in the air, you get a feeling that this is something that was totally unique. You were being brought into your living room, an experience that you never could imagine, that you could never appreciate, and it made it real to you. This film, from the novelty point, shows the level of refugees and how they had to survive or act to survive. By the 1940s, most of the Americans were either first, second, or third generations, and they never had to experience what their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents had went through in order to come to America. And I think that the novelty rests in that aspect. I went with a straight 8 on this, only because of the fact that the rawness of what took place in the time leading up to and the involvement in the war and what was going on was so novel and open and unknown to Americans. I think it brought a new appreciation for what these people had to undergo and go through because of fascism and Nazism.
All very good points. So the setting, that's a good one to kind of knock down my grade. So I will say I originally gave this one a 5 because I think that this is not novel in its conception or its premise, and I would still maintain that, but with the caveat where you pointed out the refugee aspect. I don't know if that by itself is necessarily novel. At least in the way that I take it. It's probably more novel to you than it is to me. The reason why I knocked this down for novelty is for one specific thing. I don't think this is necessarily a novel movie because it's borrowing on so many things. Its execution is what sets it apart. And I think this is a movie that isn't necessarily original. It was a better version, either acted, directed, written than anything up to that point or in many ways since. And so that's where it separates itself. And I think that represents in either its legacy or its classicness more than it should in novelty. So I'm going to give it a 6.5.
Okay. Well, I do know that when, it was Sunday, December 7th, 1941, the bombing at Pearl Harbor. By Monday morning, we were, it was a matter of just due course that the president was going to ask for a declaration of war and was going to speak before Congress that day. And Warner, as most of the theaters or the studios did, started going through all of their stock scripts that had been submitted, looking for things that were pro-American, that would help Americans deal with come to terms with war and what war was and what war was likely to be.
The incoming trauma.
Yeah. And so this film was one of them that was sitting there, and they went, oh, well, this could be a film that would make sense, that would fit within that category. And I think that there's a whole series of those films that were done about that time, about the struggles that were going on. There's a very underrated film that's kind of been lost to the public in general, a film called To Be or Not to Be. It was a comedy, but it starred Jack Benny, Carol Lombard, and why am I drawing? The actor who did Unsolved Mysteries.
Robert Stack.
Robert Stack. And it was done about the 19 January. It was released finished filming in January of 42, and it shows a acting troupe trying to deal with Nazism in kind of a humorous way in 1939 Poland. And again, this is another film that was done by Warner Brothers that just is trying to make the situation of the war more real to Americans, to understand what is likely to happen and what they're going to go through. So I think that that's where the novelty rises. And I'm just making this argument to justify the 8 I've given it.
That's fine. I mean, that's why we are here. Classicness, I will go with a 9.5. And ultimately, this is having the only caveats I will place on this are that it doesn't seem to fit with our caricaturization of the Nazis or of the severity of the war this movie was made early on in the war, before we had really sold into this like pure evil narrative that we've now given weight to. The amount of times that they mention that Victor Laszlo escaped a concentration camp, and that seems rather minuscule by comparison to the severity that we now take anytime somebody mentions a Nazi concentration camp. Those just small things added up to a little bit of that, and there are a couple of things that you could say that kind of undercut the film as far as details. I'm not going to, because honestly, sometimes the details get a little bit too involved when people, the historical accuracy and some of that doesn't. No, the story is what's important and how you execute the story as opposed to some of it. Yes, some of that can come in and that does make a distraction, but when that is the be-all, end-all, I don't buy into that. So I gave it a 9.5.
Okay, I always laugh because the number of times you'll have historical novels, which are historical fiction, and people just take it for granted that there's a certain element of liberalism that's taken by the author as far as how, the accuracy of the history in order to make the story justified. And people just accept that. But
you mean the social media narrative to add a disclaimer to every Crown episode that it's a historical fiction?
Yeah. But the minute it's made into a movie, oh my God, this has to be, is the reason because instead of it being your imagination and pulling it off the page in written word, it's acted out so that the visualization makes it more real, so you have to be more accurate. I never have understood the exact point of that, but
there's a balancing act where the fictionalized version becomes the decided upon truth of the accuracy of the event. Because people assume the audience is too lazy to know the difference between what really happened, what you could put in something like a documentary, or the dramatization version. And
Well,
I think that in two respects. One is awfully cynical of the audience and really not fair. But two, in some ways, I understand their point because it's borne out in a lot of different events and how we look at certain things.
yeah, because you think about it and just put it in context. The Battle of Lexington and Concord. How many riders were there? There were two, but Longfellow couldn't figure out a rhyme for, I believe the guy's name was William Dawes. So therefore he was excluded from the poem and it became the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So only Paul Revere is remembered because that's what popular culture adopted.
So what did you have down for classicness?
I had a 9 just because, again, if it was just the last scene, I'd have a 10 because I could, like you commented earlier in the show tonight, I could watch the last scene, every week and find it entertaining. The rest of the film, yeah, it's something that I personally like to watch about once a year. And the funny thing is it's kind of like a classic piece of literature. Every time you read it, you seem to glean something new that you didn't think about.
Yep.
Not just classical. The Bible is another aspect. Every time you read it, you come up with something new that you didn't think about. Even though
be careful with the religious interpretation.
Okay, and I understand.
We are likely speaking to a rather liberal and it's not atheistic, but agnostic audience.
Yes, but I have a very open and liberal view of religion, so people just have to accept me for that aspect. That I have that
flower that you are.
Yes. Anyway, the point being is that every time I watch the film, I come up with something or find some subtlety, something that's done by the actors or a line that I didn't think about the way it was delivered. I really think that for anybody watching this for the first time, they should watch the film, wait about a month, watch it again, wait a month, watch it again. By the third time, I think you will really understand how good this film is and what it really shows as far as cinematic achievement.
All right, rewatchability. So you and I probably are about the same wavelength. I know I've watched this probably more than I have in any other year this year. Part of it is that I was introducing it a couple of times to a newer audience, but I'm going to give this one a 9. It's not on the favorites list. It's not even on the sub-favorites list, but it's kind of one of those that hangs around and is one I really enjoy watching or rewatching, and occasionally I'll put on because it's just a film that I like to go back to. It's just not going to be one that I'm regularly going to be putting on. There's a certain hierarchy, so I'm going to give it a 9.
I gave it a 9 as well. They always give these strange, like if an alien were to fall into your living room and you had to create a list of 10 films that the alien should watch in order to understand, American culture. I always laugh about that, but then again, I think about the fact that we had 18 different exchange students, and I had a list of films that I felt that the exchange students should all watch, and we tried to watch them every year with the exchange students so that they had some grasp of things, because they didn't, some of these things were very American. Some of these things were idiotic, probably, if you start looking at the fact that I always showed Caddyshack and Dodgeball to the exchange students because they so epitomize so much of American humor that I just thought they should see them. But this is a film that should be on that list. And I think it was one that every exchange student that we had watched or I at least tried to get them to watch for that very reason.
I would very readily agree with your assessment there that there are, and I think part of the reason that I wanted to do this is I think by the end of it we will have come up with the curated list of the movies you absolutely have to watch if you're not somebody that comes to movies naturally or whatever. While we were in the middle of quarantine and there were certain ones that would come across TCM or that I would try and show Sarah because it was simply a matter of almost going through a film study or film history class. And so trying to come up with the 25 top movies that everybody should see, I would definitely have this on that list. So I would absolutely agree just generally with that assessment. But for the final score of this particular film, I will just quickly remind everyone of the scores. That is a 9.75 for legacy, 8.25 for impact significance, 7.25 for novelty, 9.25 for classicness, 9 for rewatchability, 9.5 in the audience score, adds up to a 53 total, and number 5 on our current list.
Wow.
I'd be very curious. We've talked about doing revisits. I'd be very curious if we had a guest who either wasn't familiar or was extremely familiar with the film, if that would make a difference in how this one was scored.
I would have thought this would have come out much higher than 5th.
The novelty is what ended up killing it. As well as the impact significance. And I think that's why we've created this, is you have to go through so many different levels of the grading system. So
yeah.
Remaining questions. Number 1. How did Laszlo just escape a Nazi concentration camp? They say that like it's so easy to do. Like he was Steve McQueen in The Great Escape.
Even he got caught.
Yeah. Like it seems such a throwaway that it seems out of place with our modern sensibilities post Schindler's List.
Yeah.
Do you have a remaining question?
I have a couple. Why does Laszlo have a cut above his eye?
Yeah, I've never understood that one either.
Because it's not a scar. It wasn't anything, because I've looked at different photos of Paul Heinrich. It's not anything. It's just in the film he has this, and there's no explanation.
You mean Paul Henreid?
Or, excuse me, yes. So I've never understood it, but...
All right, what was your other one?
This is one of the great mysteries of film. It's been written about, it's been speculated about, it's been quoted, and in fact, Roger Ebert said it's true in his last book. Jack Benny makes a cameo in this film. Jack Benny at the time in 1941 was on contract with Warner Brothers, and for some reason, Jack Warner told him to show up, and they were going to put him in a crowd scene. And I have watched this film so many times with the specific purpose of trying to find Jack Benny in this film. And Jack Benny said he was in the film. Roger Ebert said he was in the film, but I've never been able to find him.
Have you Googled this?
Yes. And it's listed both as an urban legend and as a fact. So it depends on the source or who says it is. You know, it's treated like it's a fact. Some people have said, well, we've never been able to find him, so therefore it must be just a legend.
Apocryphal.
Yes, but it's something that even Roger Ebert wrote and said, yes, Jack Benny is in the film. And he said, I'm not going to tell you where. You need to watch and find him.
One of the worst Easter eggs of all time. All right. Why did Renault not arrest Rick? Everything to that point had been in his own self-interest. He had shown no morals, scruples, whatever name you want to call it. There was no indication that he was going to do otherwise, other than the fact that every other character had decided on the altruistic decision. It makes for a better ending, but I just don't understand his motivation.
Well, the only thing I could think of is that either you can give it the great, he came to terms or realized what he was doing and whatever. You could give it that spin, or you can do the other one, which is Renault thought, hey, look, Rick got the better of me. Heinrich got away. So if I stick around, the Germans are going to come in and I'm done. So I might as well leave because my situation here is over. I am not going to be able to continue to handle the police here in Casablanca and be able to take the graft that I want. So what's the best option? Well, okay, I'll go off further.
Yeah, I certainly understand that. I guess that's a little bit further than I had gone in my mind, and I guess I could see the selfish calculation in that point. It's just not immediately apparent. Do you have any others?
No, I would like to point out one thing, and when I read it, I in preparation for the film for tonight, Dooley Wilson, who played Sam, was a drummer. He did not know how to play the piano, so the piano music was dubbed in, excuse me, and he only pretended. And I watched, going, boy, he certainly seems like he knows how to play the piano, but
he
had no knowledge.
We have enough musicians over the course of film history that have looked like they knew what they were doing and were dubbed. The only one, and I'll put this as a more of a curiosity than one I'm actually wanting an answer to, but is something you brought up earlier, and what are the other endings? I think that the ending is so perfect in its own self that I don't think I ever really want to know what the other endings are, but it is a point of curiosity. I wish we could talk longer, but I'm expecting a friend for dinner. Again, we will be back in a few weeks. Thank you to everyone for a special first season. Happy New Year and happy 2021. We will see you on the other side where we'll have a lot more fun planned. If you'd like to email the show, please email us at greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's greatestalltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Anchor FM.